Hello, everyone. Welcome to our brand new podcast series on industry and market analysis, an initiative brought to you by marketresearchreports.com. In this series, our hosts, Mike and Samantha, discuss key aspects of selected topics, providing valuable insights tailored for business professionals and decision makers. For those with limited time to navigate countless articles and videos, they'll do the legwork for you, delivering concise and actionable information. Let's get started.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into some really significant shifts that happened in the global agrochemical trade, looking specifically at the period between 2018 and 2024.
Yeah, it was quite a turbulent time. And the analysis we're drawing on today, it comes from the excellent data and information provided by marketresearchreports.com.
Absolutely. And we really need to give a special thank you to Sudeep Chakravarti as well. His contributions were invaluable in pulling this analysis together for our deep dive today.
Definitely. What really jumps out when you look at this 2018 to 2024 window is just the sheer scale of the disruption.
It wasn't just one thing, was it?
Not at all. It was like a perfect storm, really. You had trade wars kicking off, new tariffs being slapped on goods. Those are basically taxes on imports, right?
Right.
Then you had export bans, countries suddenly deciding not to ship things out, and on top of all that, international sanctions adding another layer of complexity.
It sounds incredibly tangled.
It is very interconnected. So our goal today is to try and, unravel some of that complexity. We want to break down what these major events mean for anyone trying to follow global economic trends, and especially for understanding the supply of essential agricultural inputs.
Okay. And the Market Research Reports Inc. analysis highlights some key flashpoints, doesn't it?
It does. We're going to look closely at how that U.S.-China trade war hit the pesticide market specifically.
And then there were the U.S. tariffs on fertilizers coming from Morocco and Russia.
Yep, that's another big one. Plus, China's own actions to restrict its fertilizer exports that had huge ripple effects.
And you can't ignore the impact of sanctions on Russia and Belarus, especially after 2022.
Absolutely not. What's crucial to understand is that these weren't just isolated events happening in sequence. They overlapped, they interacted, they amplified each other sometimes.
So it wasn't just about changing where goods flowed from.
Well, that was a huge part of it. Traditional trade routes got seriously disrupted, but it also forced countries and companies to completely rethink their sourcing strategies. And ultimately, the people feeling it on the ground were farmers all over the world, facing much higher costs for essential inputs.
That context is vital. Understanding these shifts is key to grasping current agricultural economics and how fragile or perhaps adaptable these global supply chains really are.
Exactly. It's a fascinating, if complex, story.
Okay, let's dive in. Where should we start? Maybe with that U.S.-China trade war. That seemed to be a major trigger back in 2018.
Yeah, that's a good place to start. The trade war officially kicked off in 2018, and the agrochemical sector got pulled into the fray pretty quickly.
How specifically? What happened?
Well, under what's called Section 301, it's a tool the U.S. uses against what it sees as unfair trade practices. They imposed extra duties, extra tariffs on a whole load of Chinese pesticides.
How significant were these tariffs?
They were pretty hefty. We're talking a 25% tariff slapped on 113 different types of Chinese pesticide technical ingredients. Those are like the raw, basic chemical components.
Wow, 25% is a big jump.
It is. And on top of that, another 7.5% tariff on 18 other types of finished pesticide chemicals. These really targeted the core stuff that U.S. agribusiness gets from China, which, remember, is the world's biggest pesticide producer.
And I assume China responded.
Oh, absolutely. You don't poke a major trading partner like that without expecting a reaction. China hit back with its own set of tariffs targeting U.S. agricultural products and chemicals. It became a sort of tit for tat.
So what were the immediate effects of this chemical warfare, so to speak?
Well, the most direct impact was felt by U.S. agrochemical distributors. Their costs went up because those Chinese insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, they all became more expensive overnight.
And those costs eventually find their way to the farmers, right?
Exactly. It squeezed margins for the distributors, and ultimately, it meant higher input costs for American farmers. At the same time, Chinese exporters started seeing their U.S. market share threatened because the tariffs made their products less competitive price-wise.
But the report mentioned something interesting, a kind of preemptive buying surge.
Yeah, that's a fascinating bit of market reaction. U.S. importers, anticipating these tariffs and perhaps expecting them to get even worse, actually ramped up their purchases from China in 2018 and into 2019.
So they were front-loading, buying ahead.
Precisely. They wanted to stock up before the full weight of the tariffs really kicked in and pushed prices even higher.
Which led to a weird situation, didn't it? Like China's exports actually went up initially.
Exactly. It's a bit counterintuitive, but China's pesticide exports to the U.S. saw a noticeable spike in 2019. It was this rush to buy before the higher costs became unavoidable. It shows how tariffs don't just raise prices, they can also create these temporary, sort of weird distortions in trade flows as businesses try to game the system or at least mitigate the damage.
Okay, so that was the initial reaction. What happened after that spike? Did the volumes drop off?
They did adjust downwards after 2019, yeah. The tariffs started to bite more consistently, but interestingly, the analysis points out that even after the drop, Chinese pesticide volumes to the U.S. still remained higher than they were before the trade war started.
That is interesting. But this disruption must have created an opening for other countries, surely.
Oh, absolutely. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does global trade, it seems. India, in particular, really emerged as a significant alternative supplier of agrochemicals to the U.S. market.
India. Why them specifically?
Well, India has a strong capability in producing generic crop protection chemicals. They can make effective alternatives to the big branded products, often at very competitive costs. So as U.S. importers were looking to diversify away from the now more expensive Chinese suppliers, India became a really attractive option.
So it wasn't just about finding any alternative, but a cost-effective and reliable one.
Exactly. It wasn't just price. It was about securing a stable supply chain away from the trade war uncertainty. We saw a really notable growth spurt in Indian pesticide exports to the U.S. during this period.
So it sounds like this whole trade spat basically forced a major reshuffling of the global pesticide supply chain.
That's a great way to put it, a real reshuffling. You had China perhaps shifting its focus to other export markets, maybe concentrating on higher value, more specialized products. And meanwhile, India significantly increased its market share, especially in supplying those key pesticide ingredients.
And what about the big multinational agrochemical companies? How did they react?
They started rethinking their whole global footprint. The tariffs and the general uncertainty made relying too heavily on one country, like China, look increasingly risky. So many firms, both Chinese ones and Western multinationals, began actively investing in building or expanding manufacturing hubs in other locations.
Like where?
Southeast Asia was one area that saw increased investment. Latin America, too, to some extent. It was all about spreading the risk, diversifying production, and building more resilient supply chains that weren't quite so vulnerable to a trade dispute between two giants.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, pesticides were one part of it, but fertilizers were another huge piece of this puzzle, weren't they? The U.S. actions weren't limited to China.
No, not at all. In 2020, the focus shifted, or rather expanded, to include phosphate fertilizers coming from Morocco and Russia. The U.S. Department of Commerce launched investigations into imports from these two countries.
What was the accusation?
The claim was that producers in Morocco and Russia were benefiting from unfair government subsidies, which allowed them to sell their fertilizers in the U.S. at artificially low prices, hurting domestic producers.
And these investigations led to tariffs as well.
They did. In early 2021, the U.S. imposed what are called countervailing duties, or CVDs. These are specifically designed to offset those alleged subsidies.
How high were these duties?
For Morocco's state-owned OCP, which is a massive global player in phosphates, the duty was set at around 20%. For Russian producers, it varied, but some faced duties ranging from 9% all the way up to 47%.
And the justification was to protect the American fertilizer industry.
That was the stated goal, yes.
Yeah.
Primarily to help level the playing field for domestic producers, with one company, Mosaic Co., often cited as a key intended beneficiary.
So you slap a 20% tariff on the biggest foreign supplier, Morocco. What happens to those trade flows?
They changed dramatically and very quickly. Morocco had been the #1 source of imported phosphate fertilizer for the U.S. They were shipping huge amounts, over 2 million metric tons back in 2019.
And after the tariff?
It plummeted. Once that nearly 20% duty hit, it just became uneconomical for OCP to sell into the U.S. market. The report notes they effectively stopped shipments altogether after 2021.
Wow, just stopped.
Pretty much. It shows just how powerfully tariffs can redirect trade, almost like turning off a tap.
Okay, so if the main supplier is suddenly out of the picture, the U.S. has a big gap to fill in its phosphate needs. Where did they look?
Well, they had to scramble a bit. They turned to other potential suppliers. Countries like Peru and Jordan were looked at more closely.
Could they fully replace the Moroccan volume?
Not really, no. The analysis indicates that the overall import volumes the U.S. managed to bring in from these alternative sources were lower than what they'd been getting from Morocco previously.
So less supply coming in from abroad, less import competition. I'm guessing prices within the U.S. started to climb.
You guessed it. With reduced import competition, domestic U.S. phosphate fertilizer prices started a sharp upward trend.
I bet farmers were too happy about that.
Not at all. Farmer groups and other industry associations became quite vocal, raising serious concerns. They argued that these tariffs were hitting them at the worst possible time, with input costs already rising due to other global factors like energy prices and supply chain snags.
It raises that classic tension, doesn't it? Protecting a domestic industry versus ensuring affordable inputs for another critical sector like agriculture.
Precisely. It's a really difficult balancing act. And the report really drives this home. It points out that a composite index measuring U.S. fertilizer prices actually shot up to an all-time high by March 2022.
An all-time high, even higher than previous peaks.
Even surpassing the big price spikes we saw back around 2008, yeah. Now, it's important to say that the 2022 shock had multiple causes converging: the energy crisis, logistical issues, and then the war in Ukraine starting.
Right, we'll get to that.
But these phosphate tariffs on Moroccan and Russian imports definitely played a role. They exacerbated an already tight situation in the U.S. market.
Is there any way to quantify the cost impact on farmers?
There were estimates suggesting that if, say, a 25% import tariff was fully passed through to the farmer, it could add over $100 per ton to the cost of potash or phosphate fertilizer.
Over $100 a ton. And how much of a farmer's budget is fertilizer typically?
For major crops like corn and wheat in the U.S., fertilizer can be a huge chunk of their operating costs. The report mentions figures around 35%, 36%. So adding that kind of extra cost per ton is a massive financial blow.
That's significant. Now, were these tariffs set in stone or was there any flexibility?
Interestingly, no, they weren't necessarily permanent. There was a review process. In late 2023, following a decision by the U.S. Court of International Trade, the duty on Moroccan phosphate was actually lowered quite dramatically, down to just 2% for a period.
And did that bring Moroccan fertilizer back?
It did lead to OCP resuming some shipments to the U.S., yes, but the whole situation highlights the volatility, As of early 2024, the policy environment was still somewhat uncertain, with potential for further changes.
It really shows how these trade interventions, even if aimed at one goal, can have these ripple effects, these potential boomerang effects, raising costs elsewhere and forcing complex adjustments in supply chains that might not even be more efficient in the long run.
That's a perfect summary of the dilemma. Protectionism can come at a significant cost.
Okay, let's pivot back to China. We talked about them being on the receiving end of U.S. tariffs on pesticides, but they also took action themselves, didn't they? Particularly regarding fertilizer exports.
Yes, absolutely. Starting in late 2021, Beijing implemented a series of measures that effectively restricted the export of key fertilizers from China. We're talking mainly about urea, which is a major nitrogen fertilizer, and phosphate fertilizers like DLA and MAP.
Why did they do that? What was the motivation?
The primary driver was domestic concerns. They wanted to ensure that China itself had enough fertilizer available for its own large agricultural sector, and they were also trying to put a lid on rapidly rising domestic fertilizer prices, which were causing concern internally.
So how did they restrict exports? Was it an outright ban?
Not always an outright ban, but measures that had a similar effect. They used things like export quota controls, basically limiting the total amount that could be shipped out. They introduced stricter licensing requirements for exporters and significantly increased the number and intensity of inspections at ports. All of this combined to make exporting fertilizer much more difficult and costly, effectively capping the outflow.
And China's role in the global fertilizer market is huge, right? We mentioned their dominance in pesticides.
Just as big, if not bigger, in fertilizers. China is the world's largest exporter of phosphate fertilizers, bar none, and they're also a massive global supplier of urea. So when a player of that magnitude decides to turn down the export tap, the global market feels it immediately.
And the data shows that impact clearly.
Oh, crystal clear. Chinese fertilizer exports took a nosedive. Urea exports fell by nearly a quarter, 24% in 2022 compared to the year before. Phosphate exports, DAP and MAP, also saw really significant drops as these restrictions bit hard.
Did it continue into 2023?
It actually intensified in the first half of 2023. The year-on-year declines were even steeper, urea exports down something like 58%, and phosphate exports down around 60%. We're talking millions of tons of fertilizer being effectively removed from the world market.
And this was happening at a time when global supplies were already tight and prices were climbing due to the other factors we've discussed.
Exactly. It was throwing fuel on an already burning fire. This reduction in supply from the world's biggest exporter was a major contributing factor, pushing those global benchmark prices for fertilizers to multi-year highs. DAP prices, for instance, had roughly doubled by the end of 2021, partly due to these anticipated Chinese restrictions kicking in.
So countries that normally relied heavily on Chinese fertilizers suddenly had to look elsewhere. Who was most affected?
Major fertilizer importers, particularly across Asia, were really left scrambling. Think about countries like India, Vietnam, Malaysia. They rely heavily on imports to feed their populations and support their agriculture.
Where did they turn? Who became the alternative suppliers?
Well, they had to get creative and often pay more. India, being a massive buyer, significantly ramped up its purchases from places like Russia, which often offered discounts, as we'll discuss, but also from Oman and the UAE. Southeast Asian nations looked toward suppliers like Morocco and Egypt for phosphates to replace the Chinese volumes.
But you mentioned they often had to pay more.
Yes, that was a key challenge. These alternative non-Chinese suppliers generally charged higher prices than what buyers were used to paying for Chinese fertilizers. So diversifying supply often came with a higher price tag, adding to the cost burden for these importing nations.
It sounds like China's move, while perhaps illogical from their domestic perspective, might have damaged their reputation as a reliable global supplier in the eyes of some big buyers.
That's definitely a perception highlighted in the analysis. This idea of China potentially being an unreliable supplier, willing to cut off exports for domestic reasons, really pushed major buyers to prioritize diversifying their sources, even if it meant paying more in the short term. Security of supply became paramount.
Did things ease up eventually with the Chinese restrictions?
There was some easing in late 2022 and into 2023. Global fertilizer prices started to come down from their peaks as some of China's restrictions were relaxed a bit. And crucially, new fertilizer production capacity started coming online in other parts of the world. China did resume some exports, but modestly. The volumes generally remained well below what the world market had been used to seeing before late 2021.
So the takeaway here is that a major supplier's internal policy decisions can send shockwaves through global markets.
Absolutely. And in this case, China's effort to control its own domestic inflation, in a way, ended up exporting inflation to other countries that depended on its fertilizers. It's a stark example of global interdependence.
Okay, this brings us inevitably to the next major disruption, the Russia-Ukraine war starting in early 2022. This added a whole new massive layer of complexity, didn't it?
A massive layer, yes. The war represented a profound shock to the entire global agricultural system, and fertilizers were right at the heart of it.
Remind us of Russia's role in the fertilizer market before the war.
Huge. Russia was one of the world's top fertilizer exporters across the board. Think about 16% of globally traded nitrogen, 12% of phosphates, and then potash.
Ah, yes, potash. Russia and Belarus together were dominant there?
Completely dominant. Together, Russia and Belarus accounted for something like 40% of global potash exports. Potash is crucial, especially for certain crops and soil types. So disrupting supply from these two was always going to have major consequences.
Now, there were attempts to exempt fertilizers from sanctions, weren't there? For humanitarian reasons, to avoid a food crisis.
That's correct. Most direct sanctions explicitly carved out exemptions for food and fertilizer trade. However, the reality on the ground was much more complicated.
How so?
Even without direct sanctions on the product itself, the broader sanctions on Russian banks, shipping insurance, the general reluctance of many international companies to handle Russian business, plus logistical chaos, it all combined to severely disrupt established trade patterns.
And Belarus was already facing some sanctions before the war.
Yes, the EU had already put sanctions on Belarusian potash exports back in 2021 related to political issues there. Those sanctions were then tightened significantly after Belarus facilitated the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Plus, Belarus lost access to its key export routes via Baltic Sea ports in Lithuania, which was a massive logistical hurdle.
So even with exemptions, the flow of fertilizer from both countries was seriously hampered. What was the immediate impact on global prices this time?
Another dramatic surge. Prices, which were already incredibly high from the factors we've discussed, just went stratospheric in March 2022, right after the invasion.
That all-time high index you mentioned earlier.
That was it. Bloomberg's Green Markets Index hit its absolute peak then. Spot prices for key nutrients like potash and nitrogen basically doubled or even tripled compared to where they'd been just a year earlier in already elevated 2021 levels.
Doubled or tripled. That's an unbelievable shock to the system for farmers globally.
It was immense. It sent shockwaves through global agriculture, massively inflating production costs everywhere and raising serious fears about food security.
But trade didn't just stop entirely, did it? Like with the other disruptions, did new patterns emerge?
They did. It became a story of divergence and redirection. Countries that didn't impose sanctions on Russia saw an opportunity.
Like India, you mentioned earlier.
India is a prime example. They significantly increased their imports of Russian fertilizers, often securing them at a discount compared to the soaring global market prices. Russia needed buyers, India needed fertilizer. It was a strategic alignment. Russia's share of India's potash imports, for example, reportedly jumped from under 5% in 2021 to nearly 30% by 2023.
So Russia found new markets, or expanded existing ones, outside the West.
Exactly. They redirected significant volumes towards countries like Turkey, nations across Latin America, and parts of Africa. Brazil, another huge agricultural powerhouse and potash importer, largely maintained its reliance on Russian supplies because finding affordable alternatives in the required volumes was extremely difficult.
What about Belarus? How did they fare under tighter sanctions?
Belarus had a tougher time. They generally saw their market share decline in most traditional destinations due to the sanctions and logistical blocks. However, they did manage to increase shipments, particularly potash, to China, largely moving it via rail links.
And on the other side, how did Western importers, the EU, the US, others who were applying sanctions or trying to move away from Russian-Belarusian supply, adapt?
They had to pivot and often pay more. For potash, the big winner was Canada. Canada is already a major potash producer, and they significantly ramped up production to meet the surging demand from the US and Europe. The US became almost totally reliant on Canadian potash.
And for phosphates and nitrogen.
Europe, for instance, looked more towards Morocco again for phosphates, but also to Israel, Egypt, and Jordan. For nitrogen product suppliers in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Qatar, as well as the US itself, stepped up exports to Europe.
But this shift came at a cost for Western buyers, presumably.
Absolutely. Securing these non-Russian, non-Belarusian sources generally meant paying a premium. You had higher freight costs involved in some cases, and you were buying in a market where prices had already hit record highs. For Europe especially, ensuring fertilizer security came with a hefty price tag.
It's fascinating, though, that the report mentions global fertilizer trade volumes actually recovered by the end of 2023. And Russia's total exports were even higher than in 2021.
That's a really crucial point. It shows that the sanctions and disruptions didn't eliminate Russian fertilizer from the global market. They fundamentally rerouted it. Russia managed to find enough alternative buyers to actually increase its overall export volumes compared to pre-war levels.
But maybe less efficiently.
Yes, almost certainly with efficiency losses,
Yeah.
longer shipping routes, reliance on potentially less established logistical chains, dealing through new intermediaries. It wasn't necessarily a smooth transition. The net effect was that initial brutal price spike felt globally, followed by a major ongoing reorganization of global trade flows rather than a simple reduction in supply.
So if we zoom out and look at the whole 2018-2024 period, what's the big picture regarding how major agricultural economies change their sourcing strategies?
I think the dominant theme is definitely diversification. There was a clear, widespread adaptation across major economies. They actively sought out new trade partners and reduced their reliance on single sources that had suddenly become risky or expensive.
Can we recap some of those key shifts? The U.S., for instance.
Right. The U.S., faced with tariffs on Morocco and Russia, significantly increased phosphate imports from places like Saudi Arabia and Mexico. Saudi Arabia actually hit record urea exports to the U.S. in 2022. And for potash and ammonia, the U.S. leaned much more heavily on domestic production and, as we said, Canadian supplies.
And the EU, moving away from Russia.
The EU pivoted quite strongly. They looked to Morocco, Israel, Egypt, Jordan for phosphates. Canada became the go-to for potash. OCP in Morocco diverted volumes that might have gone to the U.S. towards Europe, and Saudi Arabia also increased phosphate supply to the EU.
India's strategy seemed quite pragmatic.
Very much so. India struck strategic agreements to secure those discounted fertilizers from Russia, while simultaneously boosting imports from Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Egypt, especially for phosphates and ammonia. And let's not forget, India also stepped up its own pesticide exports during this period.
Brazil kept trading with Russia, but also looked elsewhere.
Yeah, Brazil maintained its significant trade with Russia, particularly for potash, but also increased imports from Canada and, interestingly, Iran. They also started looking more seriously at developing their own domestic potash mining potential.
So the common thread running through all this is de-risking.
Exactly. De-risking through diversification. The period starkly illustrated the perils of being overly dependent on a single supplier or a single geopolitical bloc. Everyone learned that lesson the hard way.
And clearly, some countries emerged as beneficiaries from all this disruption.
Definitely. Saudi Arabia and Egypt stand out. Their established fertilizer production capacity allowed them to step in and capture significant market share, boosting their exports substantially.
And we mentioned India, but also Turkey.
Yes. India and Turkey also leveraged their growing capabilities in agrochemical manufacturing, increasing their roles both as suppliers and potentially as hubs within these reconfigured supply chains.
So the end result is a fragmented,
Yeah.
or maybe multipolar supply chain.
Multipolar is a good word for it.
Yeah.
You see greater involvement and influence from players in the Middle East, South Asia, and even Latin America compared to the pre-2018 landscape. It's a more complex, potentially more resilient, but also maybe less efficient map than before.
But let's talk about the bottom line impact. All these disruptions, tariffs, bans, sanctions, rerouting, they must have hit farmers' wallets hard.
Oh, undeniably. The direct impact on costs for farmers and then downstream for food industries was severe. Farmers across the globe faced absolutely soaring input costs between 2018 and 2024.
Do we have numbers on that?
Well, in the U.S., for example, the report notes that farmers' total spending on fertilizer reached a staggering $35.8 billion in 2023.
$35.8 billion.
Yeah. And groups like the American Farm Bureau Federation observed that fertilizer prices shot right to the top of the list of concerns for many farmers. Prices, in some cases, literally doubled between 2020 and 2022.
And governments had to step in sometimes.
In many places, yes. The Indian government, for instance, had to significantly increase its budget for fertilizer subsidies just to try and cushion the blow for its farmers and stabilize domestic food prices. It became a major fiscal burden.
What are the potential knock-on effects when fertilizer costs get that high? Do farmers just use less?
That's often the consequence, yes. Faced with unaffordable prices, farmers might reduce their fertilizer application rates. That, in turn, can lead to lower crop yields per acre.
Lower yields mean less food produced.
Exactly. Or in extreme cases, farmers might even decide it's not economical to plant certain fields at all, leaving land fallow. And these higher costs for basic grains and oilseeds, stemming partly from fertilizer prices, were a major contributing factor to the global food price inflation that peaked in 2022. We all felt that at the grocery store.
And it doesn't stop there, does it? What about industries that use those agricultural outputs?
Right, think about food processors, biofuel producers, the livestock feed industry. They all rely on those farm outputs. When the cost of grains and oilseeds goes up, their raw material costs increase, putting pressure on their margins. They then either have to absorb those costs, which hurts profitability, or pass them on to consumers, leading to higher prices for finished goods.
So it really sounds like these trade disruptions fundamentally introduce significant inefficiencies and higher cost structures throughout the entire agrochemical supply chain.
That's a very accurate way to put it. And that added cost burden ended up being shared, really, among farmers, governments footing subsidy bills, and ultimately consumers paying more for food and other goods.
Do we see any positive adaptations emerge from this high-cost environment?
Yes, there were some. It certainly spurred renewed interest in things like precision agriculture, using technology to apply fertilizer much more efficiently, only where it's needed, to minimize waste. There was also increased focus on developing and adopting biological alternatives to chemical fertilizers, though that's a longer-term shift. And as mentioned, efforts in some regions to boost domestic fertilizer production to reduce import reliance gained traction.
So, bringing this deep dive towards a conclusion, what's the main takeaway from this turbulent 2018-2024 period for agrochemicals?
I think the clearest takeaway is just how profoundly trade policy and geopolitical events can shape and frankly disrupt these absolutely vital global wickets. It was a stark demonstration of the power these forces have.
And really highlighted the interconnectedness, maybe even the fragility of these supply chains.
Absolutely. It showed just how sensitive the global agrochemical supply chain is to these kinds of policy shocks and geopolitical earthquakes. One event in one part of the world can send ripples everywhere.
But we also saw adaptation, didn't we? Strategic responses, diversification.
We certainly did. Countries and companies weren't just passive victims. We saw deliberate strategies to diversify suppliers, hedge risks, and we witnessed the rise of new or newly important players stepping into the gaps in the market.
And underlying it all were those significant cost implications, hitting farmers first and then echoing through the wider economy.
That economic pain was very real and widespread. It underscores why stability in these markets is so important.
So maybe a final thought for our listeners to ponder. Given everything we've discussed, all the lessons learned, hopefully learned from this period, how might we see future trade negotiations or sourcing strategies evolving? How do nations and businesses now try to balance their own interests, their security needs, with this fundamental requirement for a stable, affordable supply of critical farm inputs, especially in a global landscape that seems to be getting more complex, not less?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? Finding that balance between national priorities, resilience, efficiency, and affordability in these essential global supply chains, that's going to be a central challenge for policymakers and businesses for years to come. Definitely something to keep thinking about.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast and found it valuable for enhancing your knowledge and understanding. Don't forget to browse our website, marketresearchreports.com, where you'll find tens of thousands of research reports spanning various industries. These insights are designed to empower decision makers and help you stay ahead of the competition.